All right, I'm ready. Ready to get started. Okay. If you're a project manager, a PMO leader, or someone responsible for delivering projects on time and within budget, then this episode is for you. Welcome back to the PMO Playbook podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany. This podcast is your go-to resource for breaking down the PMI framework, tackling real-world project management challenges, and sharing strategies that will help you lead successful projects. In our last episode, we covered the project initiation phase, how to define project objectives, get stakeholder buy-in, and ensure a project is worth pursuing. If you missed it, make sure to go back and listen. And so in this podcast today, we're moving on to the second phase of project management, which is planning. This is where we build out the roadmap that will guide the entire project. According to the PMI 2023 Pulse of the Profession report, 47% of project failures are due to poor planning. That means nearly half of all failed projects could have been saved with better planning. We'll essentially cover the elements of a solid project plan, how agile frameworks like Scrum and Kanban approach planning differently, and also a case study on how Nike effectively planned their global supply chain transformation. So let's get into it. Okay, why is the planning phase so critical? Thinking of planning as the architectural blueprint of a house. You need the drawings, you need the architecture to come out and survey the land to see how much, what's the dimensions, how much acreage you have. You need all of this information before you can actually build the house, correct? So think of a project in the same manner. Without it, you're just making up things as you go, and it's a recipe for disaster. So really honing in on the key objectives of project planning. First, we're gonna define the scope, what's in and out of scope, and this also plays a part of the SOW. If you're a contractor, what is in scope is the task that you're gonna actually get paid for, and then what's out of scope is either gonna be put in the backlog or you are going to have to move this on to like a post go live type of log as well. So the second objective is to set timelines. How long will it take for the project to be completed? And what's the milestones within those timeframes? Resource planning, who's doing what, who's responsible. If it's more of like a business transformation and you're bringing in contractors, what are the contractors doing? What are the actual FTE or full-time employees? What are they doing as well? And then also, what's your budget for this project? So once you have that time frame, you have your budget, you have your resources, then you're starting to build more of a solid framework. What's the risk management? What could go wrong and what can we do to prepare? So this is where your risk mitigation plan comes in at. You want to have a strategy if anything goes wrong, or we kind of like your what ifs. If we had a mass turnover or we lost a lot of our budget due to the economy, inflation. I mean, of course, this is different things that we're dealing with right now. We're seeing a lot of this happen across the board with supply chain and tariffs and duties. So with all of these things that could possibly happen, our what ifs, this is the risk management. We want to make sure that we have a mitigation plan for that as well. And then finally, what's your communication plan? How will you update your project sponsors, your stakeholders, your team members? You want to have a communication plan so that holistically you can communicate out any updates, any success, any failures, and also the lessons learned. The biggest mistake that project managers make is assuming that the planning is one and done step. In reality, it's a living document. You'll continue to refine it over and over again as the project progresses. So I want to bring in a real life case study for Nike's supply chain transformation. So the power of strategic planning. A great example of planning matters, why planning matters, is Nike massive supply chain transformation. In 2018, Nike saw a need to rethink its global logistics network to keep up e-commerce demand. Their goal, cut delivery time in half and improve operational efficiency. But making a change this big required precise planning. And this is where I believe personally a lot of corporations go wrong. It sounds like a great idea to do a transformation until there's no plan. So you can bring on resources, you can use your full-time resources and have this whole overhaul of ideas, and it sounds like it's great. But if there's no strategy behind this, the operations will fail. There won't be a transformation. You'll just be dealing with a lot of cleanup, resources wasted, money wasted, no milestones to report on. So it's a lot that builds on top of this. And whenever you can really define that, that's whenever you really have a great project plan. So defining the scope and objectives, Nike set clear KPIs, which is your key performance indicators. What are you going to report on? This isn't where the analytics come in. Being data-driven first is so important to be able to make decisions on whether we will pour more money into this or we actually are saving money. Without knowing those numbers, it's really hard to report on those things. So by having those KPIs that are clear, defined within the scope, and making sure that everyone, the stakeholders, project sponsors, the governance board, everyone is aligned on what those KPIs will be reported on will save you so much money. So reducing delivery times was one of their KPIs, to go from 14 days to 5 days, and improving inventory accuracy. So within their resource and timeline management, they implemented automation. They use AI-driven forecasting and regional distribution centers to streamline logistics. And within the risk management, they actually anticipated risk like supplier disruptions. They built contingencies, including backup suppliers and also predictive analytics. And I also want to dive a little bit more about using backup suppliers. One contract that I just did recently, which was like a residential commercial type of company for window treatments. And something that I found really interesting that I hadn't known before, because this was only my second supply chain within my second supply chain contract. And so finding dual sources of suppliers. So like Brazil may be able to supply this one type of metal, while over here in Mexico, they are supplying the same type of metal or a similar metal, maybe similar prices, but you can have dual sourcing so that you're not dependent on one supplier. Because we did have a situation that happened where one of the suppliers actually ended up closing their factory. So there weren't any workers, the supplier closed down, and there wasn't anything that the company could do about it except for scramble to find another supplier. So it's kind of similar, like if you're no longer shopping at Walmart, then you go to a local place like Kroger, Winn-Dixie, Aldi's. So having a backup is always a good idea. Moving on to the stakeholder and communication plan, teams across logistics, IT, finance, and marketing were aligned on deliverables through each agile sprint. Because Nike spent years planning, they successfully launched their new supply chain strategy, increasing profits and also customer satisfaction. This shows that even global brands can fail if they don't invest in planning. So working on global teams have made me realize how things operate differently depending on where you are in the world. And being able to be flexible, adaptable to the way that things work on the other side of the globe definitely makes you a more sustainable brand, and realizing that will also allow you to increase your profits because you're able to flex, you're able to adapt, you're able to be ambiguous. And so with that ambiguity, it allows the company to continue to grow. So that's one thing that I really want to say about what this case study really shows me, that Nike is a global brand, of course, so that they know the stakeholders and sponsors and everyone that's involved will actually need to be able to benefit from this. It's not just worrying about the people that's only located in the US, right? Okay, so moving on to waterfall versus agile. Now, a lot of people have different theories about waterfall and agile, and I can only speak from my experience, honestly, and also my continuing education that I've done with the PMI for my PMP. And so With Agile, we're starting to see it used more fluid as something that doesn't need a plan. But in reality, when you're sprint planning, that's your plan. Even if it's a 2-week sprint, you're still planning something. So I really want to talk about the two main planning approaches, whether that's waterfall versus agile. So traditional waterfall planning follows a linear approach. It goes initiation, planning, execution, closure. So it kind of goes top down. So you're working from the initiation phase, the planning phase, the execution, and closure. And so it's best suited for like large enterprise projects, specifically maybe examples within construction, aerospace, government. And the downside of this is really once the plan is set, it's kind of difficult to make any changes to while executing because it's so structured. There isn't really room for any changes. And that's whenever you have to move things into the backlog to say, hey, post go live, that's whenever we're actually going to work on this. So moving on to agile planning, which could be Scrum or Kanban, and it uses iterative planning with short work cycles. So with, like I referenced earlier, sprints. This is best suited for dynamic environments, which usually is like software development, software implementations, startup companies. I've seen this used in many different ways. I've seen it used on software development. I've seen it used on decommissioning servers. I would say that Agile is definitely best suited for technology. Reason being, there's so many different changes. There's data that needs to be involved. There's QA, quality assurance that needs to be involved, change management, all of these different things that need to happen. And agile sprint specifically within those 2 weeks is the best thing that can really happen. And so within those 2 weeks, you're able to maximize the time because you're really focused on these point systems that you've given the project. And so really working towards the goal to have these points completed by the end of the sprint. So I've seen it work best with technology, but again, you can also use it in different industries too. So the key tools, like I mentioned, product backlog, sprint planning, Kanban boards, but the downside is if it's not managed well, it can lead to scope creep. There can be a lot of, well, we didn't get this done in the last sprint, or such and such said that they wanted to bring this into this sprint, so can we bring it in? And that's where it kind of draws like a fine line between being structured and not being structured. So that's why a lot of people will actually reference agile and sprints as something that's a lot more fluid, but then there's also the downside of random requests from leadership that will say, hey, can we add this into this sprint? So when you look at it from that perspective, that's whenever you will see the different changes that will happen. So for example, when Nike implemented their supply chain overhaul, they use a hybrid approach. And that's what a lot of companies are using right now because it's realistic. So waterfall for high level planning, but agile for execution to allow for continuous improvement. So like I mentioned, you want to continuously improve, but you also don't want to change the scope of things. You don't want to add more into the scope. Now you're increasing the budget, you're increasing the timeline. And so whenever that happens, we have to take a step back and look at the waterfall documents that we created and also continue to work on a 2-week sprint timeline. So moving on to the common pitfalls in project planning. So even experienced project managers falls into the traps of, let's go over the biggest planning mistakes. Like what are project managers actually dealing with whenever we're talking about planning mistakes? So one, the very first one would definitely be unrealistic timelines. So PMI found that only 51% of projects are completed on time. 51%. So we need to be realistic. Ignoring risk management leads for 27% of projects fail due to overlook risk. Use a risk register to document potential risk, and then also lack of stakeholder buy-in. If stakeholders aren't involved, you're expecting resistance later. So whenever the stakeholders and the project sponsors have difference of opinions, this is whenever you are really honing in to having challenges on projects. And so this really creates a lot of confusion and frustration on projects because everyone isn't aligned. The next common pitfall would be overcomplicating plans. So keeping documentation clear and actionable. No one wants to read a 100-page plan. Or recently on a contract I experienced, recreating the same documents over and over again. Like, there shouldn't be the same document in Google Sheet, the same document in Smartsheet, the same document on Jira. If we can create one repository, will allow for clear communication and also one knowledge base of all the tickets and issues, risk, the RAID log, everything that we're experiencing in that to be visible and transparent to everyone that's working on it. And then also, that also makes me think of another topic. We want to be transparent, but at the same time, you only need to give access to the people that actually need access to these different tools and platforms. I firmly believe that not everyone should have access to a smart sheet. You're having so many people make changes to a smart sheet, and now you're having some things are getting deleted. You can't keep track. You're having to go back through the list of changes that was made on this smart sheet and go back to the history. And it's causing too much confusion and frustration on a project, especially whenever documents are getting duplicated over and over again. It's creating too many issues. Okay, so moving on to the best practices for a strong project plan. So here's how to make sure your project plan actually works in the real world, because we can read the PMI and the PMP book all day long, but when it comes to the real world, that PMP is not really realistic. You are going to experience challenges that you're going to have to be fluid on. You're going to have to make changes rapidly and quickly. It's just not the real world. So having real world challenges and experiences allows for you to make better decisions when planning. So you can start off by using the SMART goals. You're going to define your specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound objectives. You're going to create a WBS, or a work breakdown structure. So breaking these large tasks into manageable work packages, and define roles clearly. By defining roles clearly, you're going to use the RACI matrix, which is responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. Next, you're going to build a contingency plan. The PMI actually recommends allocating 10 to 20% of project resources for unexpected risk. And then also, you're going to review and adjust regularly. Planning doesn't just stop after kickoff. Planning continues to happen even into execution, even into closure. You're going to have to continue to plan and continue to make updates to these documents as the project moves along. A good plan is flexible enough to adapt, but structured enough to keep teams aligned. Remember, planning is the foundation of execution. And so with that, I really hope that you guys enjoyed this episode. Just to recap, the planning phase is where you define scope, resources, risk, and schedules to set your project up for success. Nike's case study proves that a well thought out plan can save millions and a poor one can cost just as much. So today's key takeaways: a project without a plan is a roadmap without a GPS. Waterfall is best suited for structured projects, and Agile is best suited for iterative work. Common pitfalls: they're unrealistic timelines, ignoring risk, and lack of stakeholder buy-in, and keeping your plan clear, actionable, and adaptable. So next week, we'll dive into the execution phase where planning turns into action. I'll share real-world examples, agile execution strategies, and also a deep dive into how major brands implement their projects. Thanks for listening to the PMO podcast.